Sarah Martinez had always been told she was too small for military service. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, drill sergeants looked at her with doubt during basic training. But what she lacked in size, she made up for in determination and an unshakable desire to save lives. Growing up in a small Texas town, Sarah watched her father struggle with injuries from his time in Vietnam. She saw how the medics had saved his life during a fierce battle in the jungle. From that moment, she knew her calling. She would become a combat medic no matter what anyone said about her size or gender. The path wasn't easy. Sarah faced constant challenges during her medical training. Male soldiers questioned whether she could carry a wounded teammate to safety. Instructors pushed her harder than others, testing her limits every single day. But Sarah never gave up. She studied harder, trained longer, and proved herself time and again. Her big break came when she was assigned to work with Navy SEALs in Afghanistan. The elite unit had never worked with a female medic before. The 3 SEALs she was assigned to protect looked at her with skepticism. Marcus Thompson, the team leader, had been in combat for 8 years. He worried that Sarah might become a liability during dangerous missions. Jake Wilson, the team's demolitions expert, made jokes about having a babysitter on their missions. The 3rd member, Alex Rodriguez, stayed quiet but clearly had his doubts. All 3 men had seen too many good soldiers get hurt because someone on their team wasn't ready for the intensity of real combat. Sarah understood their concerns, but she was determined to prove herself. She spent extra hours studying their mission profiles and learning about each man's specialty. She memorized every detail about their medical histories and practiced emergency procedures until she could perform them in her sleep. The team's first mission together was supposed to be routine. They were tasked with gathering intelligence from a small village near the Pakistan border. The area had been quiet for weeks and military commanders expected no major resistance. It seemed like the perfect opportunity for Sarah to ease into working with the SEALs. As they prepared for the mission, Sarah checked and rechecked her medical supplies. She carried twice the normal amount of bandages, morphine, and emergency medications. Her backpack was heavier than regulation allowed, but she wanted to be ready for anything. The 3 SEALs noticed but said nothing. The helicopter dropped them 3 miles from the target village just before dawn. The plan was simple: move in quietly, gather information about enemy movement in the area, and return to base before sunset. Intelligence reports suggested only a few local fighters in the region, nothing the experienced SEAL team couldn't handle easily. As they moved through the rocky terrain toward the village, Sarah felt the weight of proving herself. Every step was a chance to show these elite soldiers that she belonged on their team. She stayed alert, watching for any signs of danger while keeping track of her teammates' positions. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains when they reached the outskirts of the village. Everything seemed peaceful. Children played in the dusty streets while women carried water from the local well. It looked exactly like the intelligence reports had described, a quiet, harmless place. But Sarah felt something was wrong. Her instincts, sharpened by months of training, told her to stay extra alert. She couldn't explain why, but the scene felt too perfect, too peaceful for a region known to have enemy activity. She kept her concerns to herself, not wanting the SEALs to think she was being paranoid on her first real mission with them. The first sign of trouble came from the silence. As the team moved closer to the village center, Sarah noticed that the children had disappeared from the streets. The women who had been drawing water were nowhere to be seen. Even the dogs that had been wandering around were gone. The village felt empty, but not naturally empty. Marcus signaled for the team to stop. His years of experience told him the same thing Sarah was feeling. Something was very wrong. He used hand signals to communicate with Jake and Alex, positioning them for better coverage of the area. Sarah stayed close behind, her medical bag ready and her weapon prepared. They had been in position for only 5 minutes when the first shots rang out. The sound echoed off the stone buildings as bullets whizzed past their heads. The team had walked directly into an ambush. Enemy fighters emerged from buildings, rooftops, and hidden positions throughout the village. There were far more than intelligence had predicted. Marcus immediately took charge, directing his team to take cover behind a low stone wall. But the enemy had planned this carefully. They had superior numbers and better positions. Within seconds, bullets were flying from every direction. The SEALs found themselves pinned down with limited options for escape. Jake tried to move to a better position, but was immediately forced back by heavy gunfire. Alex spotted several fighters on a nearby rooftop and engaged them, but more appeared to take their place. It became clear that this wasn't a random encounter. The enemy had been waiting specifically for them. The radio crackled with Marcus trying to call for backup, but the mountains interfered with the signal. They were on their own, outnumbered and outgunned in enemy territory. The nearest friendly forces were hours away, even if the distress call got through. During the intense firefight, Jake made a critical error. Seeing what he thought was an opportunity to advance, he broke cover and ran toward a building that could provide better tactical advantage. But the enemy had anticipated this move. As Jake sprinted across the open ground, multiple fighters opened fire simultaneously. Sarah watched in horror as Jake stumbled and fell. Blood immediately began spreading across his uniform. He had been hit multiple times and was lying exposed in the middle of the street. Enemy bullets continued to strike the ground around him, making it impossible for Marcus or Alex to reach him safely. Without hesitation, Sarah made a decision that would define her career. She grabbed her medical bag and sprinted toward Jake, ignoring the bullets flying around her. Marcus shouted for her to stay back, but she was already moving. Her small size actually worked to her advantage as she weaved between the enemy fire. She reached Jake just as he was losing consciousness from blood loss. 2 bullets had struck his leg, and 1 had grazed his shoulder. Sarah immediately began working to stop the bleeding while bullets continued to hit the ground inches from where they lay. She applied pressure to his wounds and gave him a shot of morphine for the pain. The problem was getting Jake to safety. He was too heavy for Sarah to carry alone, and Marcus and Alex couldn't leave their defensive positions without exposing the entire team. Sarah realized she would have to stabilize Jake right there in the open, under constant enemy fire. Working with incredible focus, Sarah managed to bandage Jake's wounds and stop most of the bleeding, but she knew he needed immediate evacuation to survive. The bullet in his leg had hit an artery, and even with her emergency treatment, he wouldn't last long without proper surgery. Using her body to shield Jake from some of the incoming fire, Sarah began dragging him toward cover. It was slow, dangerous work. Every few feet she had to stop and return fire with her own weapon to keep the enemy from advancing on their position. Marcus and Alex provided covering fire as best they could, but the enemy was closing in from multiple directions. The situation was becoming desperate. They were running low on ammunition, Jake was badly wounded, and there was still no word on backup arriving. Sarah realized that saving Jake was just the beginning of their problems. After what felt like hours but was only 20 minutes, Sarah managed to drag Jake behind the stone wall where Marcus and Alex were positioned. Jake was unconscious but stable for the moment. However, the enemy fire was intensifying, and Sarah could see fighters moving to surround their position. Marcus was trying desperately to establish radio contact with their base. The radio would work for a few seconds, then cut out due to interference from the mountains. During one brief connection, he managed to send their coordinates and request immediate evacuation. But the response was not what they hoped to hear. The nearest helicopter was dealing with another emergency and wouldn't be available for at least 2 hours. Ground forces were even further away. The team was told to hold their position and wait for backup, but Sarah knew Jake didn't have 2 hours. His pulse was getting weaker despite her treatment. Alex suddenly cried out in pain. A sniper's bullet had found its mark, striking him in the chest. He fell backward, blood spreading across his tactical vest. Sarah immediately moved to help him, leaving Jake momentarily to assess Alex's condition. The bullet had penetrated just below his bulletproof vest, and he was bleeding internally. Now Sarah had 2 critically wounded SEALs to keep alive, while enemy fighters continued their assault. Alex was conscious but in severe pain. Sarah gave him morphine and used her remaining bandages to try controlling the bleeding, but she was running out of medical supplies fast. Marcus continued fighting alone, moving between different positions along the wall to make it seem like they had more people than they actually did. But the enemy wasn't fooled for long. Sarah could hear them shouting to each other in a foreign language, coordinating their attack to overrun the small group's position. The situation became even more desperate when Marcus's rifle jammed during a critical moment. As he struggled to clear the malfunction, Several enemy fighters saw their opportunity and began advancing across the open ground toward their position. Sarah grabbed her weapon and opened fire, forcing the attackers to take cover. But in doing so, she had to leave both wounded men unattended. Jake's bleeding started again and Alex was slipping in and out of consciousness. Sarah found herself torn between fighting off the enemy and keeping her patients alive. She had never faced such an impossible situation before. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sarah made a crucial decision. She used the last of her emergency medical supplies to create more permanent bandages for both men. Then she redistributed the team's remaining ammunition, giving Marcus and herself the best weapons while keeping a pistol ready for close combat. The enemy made their major push just as the sun reached its highest point. Dozens of fighters emerged from buildings and charged toward the wall simultaneously. Marcus and Sarah fired everything they had, but there were simply too many attackers to stop them all. As enemy fighters got closer, Sarah realized they were about to be overrun. She positioned herself directly over Jake and Alex, determined to protect them even if it meant sacrificing herself. Her weapon was almost out of ammunition, and Marcus was down to his last magazine. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, Sarah heard a sound that changed everything. The distant rumble of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountains, but it wasn't the evacuation helicopter they had been promised. Instead, it was an attack helicopter that had been diverted from another mission after receiving their distress call. The helicopter appeared over the ridge and immediately began engaging the enemy fighters with its powerful weapons. The attackers scattered, running for cover in the buildings. But Sarah knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The attack helicopter couldn't stay long due to fuel limitations, and the enemy would return as soon as it left. Marcus managed to establish clear radio contact with the helicopter pilot. They coordinated a plan for the evacuation helicopter to land in a small clearing about half a mile from their current position. But getting there would mean carrying 2 wounded men across open ground while enemy fighters were still in the area. Sarah looked at Jake and Alex, both unconscious and losing blood despite her treatment. She knew that moving them was risky, but staying in their current position meant certain death for all of them. The attack helicopter pilot warned them that he could only provide cover for another 10 minutes before he would have to return to base for fuel. The evacuation plan seemed impossible. Sarah and Marcus would have to carry 2 unconscious men across half a mile of dangerous terrain, while enemy fighters hunted them. The attack helicopter could provide some cover, but not for the entire journey. They would be exposed and vulnerable for most of the trip. Sarah quickly assessed both wounded men. Jake had lost a significant amount of blood but was stable for now. Alex's internal bleeding was more serious and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Moving him could cause more damage, but leaving him meant certain death. There was no good choice. Marcus helped Sarah create makeshift stretchers using their tactical gear and some wood from a destroyed cart. They would take turns carrying each man, moving in short bursts between whatever cover they could find. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was their only option. The attack helicopter made several passes over the village, forcing enemy fighters to stay hidden. During one of these passes, Marcus and Sarah began their desperate journey. Sarah took the first shift carrying Jake while Marcus carried Alex. Both wounded men were heavier than Sarah had expected, but adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. They made it about 200 yards before the attack helicopter had to pull back to avoid ground fire. Immediately, enemy fighters emerged from buildings and began pursuing them. Sarah and Marcus found cover behind a cluster of rocks, but they were still far from the evacuation point. Alex regained consciousness briefly and insisted he could walk with support. Against Sarah's medical judgment, they helped him to his feet. He was weak and in obvious pain, but he could move slowly with Marcus's help. This allowed Sarah to focus entirely on Jake, who remained unconscious. The next section of their journey took them across a dried riverbed with no cover at all. Sarah knew they would be completely exposed to enemy fire for at least 5 minutes. The attack helicopter pilot warned them that several fighters were positioning themselves along the route ahead. Sarah made another split-second decision that surprised everyone. She told Marcus to take Alex and continue toward the evacuation point while she stayed behind with Jake. Her plan was to create a diversion that would draw the enemy fighters away from Marcus and Alex, giving them a better chance to reach safety. Marcus refused to leave her behind, but Sarah insisted it was their only option. Alex needed immediate medical attention that only a hospital could provide, and Jake was stable enough to wait a few more minutes. She promised Marcus she would find another way to get Jake to the evacuation point. Reluctantly, Marcus agreed to the plan. He helped Alex move toward the dried riverbed, while Sarah positioned herself with Jake behind a large boulder. She had only one magazine of ammunition left, but she was determined to give her teammates the time they needed. As Marcus and Alex made their way across the open ground, Sarah began firing at the enemy positions she could see. Her shots forced the fighters to take cover and focus their attention on her location instead of pursuing Marcus and Alex. The plan was working, but Sarah knew she couldn't hold them off for long. Jake briefly regained consciousness and tried to understand what was happening. Sarah explained the situation quickly while keeping watch for enemy movement. Jake insisted he could help fight, but Sarah could see he was too weak to be effective. She convinced him to conserve his strength for the evacuation. The enemy fighters realized what Sarah was doing and began coordinating an attack on her position. She could hear them moving through the rocks, getting closer to where she and Jake were hidden. Her ammunition was almost gone, and the attack helicopter was nowhere to be seen. Just when the situation seemed hopeless again, Sarah heard Marcus on the radio. He and Alex had reached the evacuation point, and the medical helicopter was landing, but Marcus wasn't leaving without Sarah and Jake. Against orders, he was heading back to help them reach the evacuation site. Sarah protested over the radio, telling Marcus to leave with Alex while he still could. But Marcus had made his decision. He told Sarah to hold her position for just a few more minutes while he worked his way back to their location. The helicopter pilot agreed to wait, despite the increasing danger. Enemy fighters were now very close to Sarah's position. She could hear their voices just on the other side of the boulder, where she and Jake were hiding. Her weapon was down to her last few bullets, and she knew a direct confrontation was inevitable. She prepared herself for what might be her final stand, determined to protect Jake no matter what happened to her. The first enemy fighter appeared around the edge of the boulder just as Sarah was checking Jake's pulse. She fired her last 3 bullets, forcing the man to retreat, but she knew more would follow. Jake was conscious now, but extremely weak. He tried to give Sarah his sidearm, but his hands were shaking too badly to be effective. Sarah heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. The enemy had surrounded their position and was closing in carefully. She had no ammunition left and nowhere to run with Jake in his condition. For a moment she considered surrendering, but she knew that wasn't really an option in this situation. Then she remembered something from her training that might save them both. In her medical bag, she still had several smoke grenades that were meant to mark landing zones for medical helicopters. If she could create enough confusion, she might be able to buy the time Marcus needed to reach them. Sarah pulled the pins on 2 smoke grenades and threw them in different directions. Thick, colored smoke immediately began filling the area around their position. The enemy fighters started shouting to each other, confused by the sudden loss of visibility. Sarah used this opportunity to move Jake to a different position behind another rock formation. The smoke provided cover, but it also made it difficult for Sarah to see approaching threats. She had to rely on sound to track enemy movement. Jake was trying to help by listening for footsteps, but his hearing was affected by the blood loss and morphine Sarah had given him earlier. Through the smoke, Sarah heard Marcus calling her name. He had made it back and was trying to locate their position without alerting the enemy to his presence. Sarah whistled quietly using a signal they had practiced during training. Marcus responded with the same signal, letting her know he was close. Marcus appeared through the smoke like a ghost, moving silently despite the rocky terrain. He had brought additional ammunition and medical supplies from the helicopter. More importantly, he had a plan to get them all out alive. The helicopter pilot had agreed to move the aircraft closer to their position, even though it meant landing in a more dangerous area. Working together, Sarah and Marcus created a makeshift stretcher for Jake using Marcus's tactical vest and 2 rifles. Jake protested that he could walk, but Sarah could see he was barely conscious. Moving him on a stretcher would be faster and safer than trying to help him walk through the difficult terrain. The smoke was beginning to clear, and enemy fighters were regrouping around their position. Marcus and Sarah would have to move quickly before they lost their cover completely. The helicopter was waiting in a small clearing only 300 yards away, but those 300 yards included steep rocky slopes and several areas with no cover at all. As they began moving toward the helicopter, Sarah realized that Jake was going into shock. His pulse was rapid and weak, and his breathing was becoming shallow. The combination of blood loss, pain, and stress was overwhelming his system. Sarah knew they had only minutes to get him to proper medical care. Marcus took the front of the stretcher while Sarah controlled the rear, using her medical training to keep Jake stable during the difficult journey. Every few steps she had to stop and check his vital signs. The morphine was wearing off and Jake was starting to feel the full extent of his injuries. Enemy fighters spotted them as they crested a small hill. Bullets began hitting the rocks around them, forcing Marcus and Sarah to take cover while still carrying Jake. Sarah positioned herself between Jake and the incoming fire, using her own body as a shield while Marcus returned fire with his rifle. The helicopter pilot could see their predicament and moved his aircraft even closer, despite the danger from enemy fire. The helicopter's door gunner began providing covering fire, forcing the enemy fighters to seek better cover. This gave Marcus and Sarah the opportunity they needed to continue their escape. During the final approach to the helicopter, Jake stopped breathing. Sarah immediately began CPR while Marcus carried the stretcher alone. She had to perform chest compressions and rescue breathing while moving across uneven ground under enemy fire. It was the most challenging medical situation she had ever faced. Just as they reached the helicopter, Jake's heart started beating again. Sarah had managed to revive him using only basic life support techniques under impossible conditions. The helicopter crew immediately took over his care, using advanced medical equipment to stabilize his condition for the flight to the hospital. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked back at the village where they had been trapped. Enemy fighters were still shooting at them, but they were finally safe. Marcus sat beside her, exhausted but alive. Through the helicopter's communication system, they learned that Alex was stable and would make a full recovery. The helicopter ride to the military hospital took 45 minutes, during which Sarah continued monitoring Jake's condition. The flight medics were impressed by the emergency treatment she had provided under combat conditions. They told her that her quick thinking and medical skills had definitely saved Jake's life. Jake regained consciousness during the flight and tried to thank Sarah for what she had done. She told him to save his strength for recovery, but he insisted on expressing his gratitude. He admitted that he had doubted her abilities before the mission and apologized for not trusting her from the beginning. At the hospital, all 3 SEALs received immediate medical attention. Alex required surgery to repair internal bleeding, but doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Jake needed multiple procedures to repair the damage from his leg wounds, but he would eventually regain full mobility. Marcus had only minor injuries but was treated for exhaustion and dehydration. Sarah stayed at the hospital for 3 days, refusing to leave until she knew all 3 men were out of danger. During this time, word of her actions spread throughout the military base. Other soldiers began approaching her to express their admiration for what she had accomplished under such difficult circumstances. The commanding officer called Sarah into his office for a formal debriefing about the mission. He had already spoken with Marcus, Jake, and Alex about what had happened during the ambush. All 3 men had provided detailed accounts of how Sarah's actions had saved their lives multiple times during the crisis. During the debriefing, Sarah was informed that she was being recommended for the Silver Star, one of the military's highest honors for valor in combat. The recommendation cited her courage in treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire and her leadership in coordinating their escape from an impossible situation. Sarah was surprised by the recognition. In her mind, she had simply done her job as a medic. She had trained for exactly these kinds of situations, and she felt that any competent medic would have acted the same way. But her commanding officer explained that very few people could have performed so effectively under such extreme pressure. The 3 SEALs made full recoveries over the following months. Jake was the last to return to active duty due to the severity of his leg injuries, but he eventually regained complete mobility. Alex returned to service within 6 weeks, and Marcus never missed more than a few days of duty. More importantly for Sarah, all 3 men requested that she be permanently assigned to their unit. They had learned to trust her completely and wanted her as their medic for future missions. This was unprecedented, as female medics had never been permanently assigned to SEAL teams before. The Silver Star ceremony took place 3 months after the mission. Sarah's parents flew in from Texas to attend the event. Her father, the Vietnam veteran who had inspired her to become a medic, was particularly proud. He told reporters that Sarah had always been determined to help others, even when people said she was too small for military service. During her acceptance speech, Sarah thanked the 3 SEALs for giving her the opportunity to prove herself. She said that the real heroes were Marcus, Jake, and Alex, who had risked their lives to serve their country. She dedicated the medal to all the combat medics who had served before her and paved the way for her success. After the ceremony, Sarah continued serving with the SEAL team for 2 more years. She participated in dozens of successful missions and became known throughout the special operations community as one of the most skilled and courageous medics in the military. Her reputation opened doors for other women seeking similar positions. When Sarah finally left active duty, she chose to work at a veterans hospital, helping soldiers who had been wounded in combat. She used the skills she had learned in the military to provide the best possible care for men and women who had sacrificed for their country. Many of her patients were surprised to learn about her combat experience, as she never talked about her own service unless asked directly. The 3 SEALs remained close friends with Sarah long after their military careers ended. They credited her with not only saving their lives but also teaching them not to judge people based on their appearance or background. Marcus often said that Sarah was the bravest soldier he had ever served with, and that working with her had made him a better leader and a better person.